They welcomed the soldiers as liberators. It would take them decades to understand they had welcomed their own conquerors. In the 2nd century before our era, a modest Italian republic, one that had only just finished fighting for its own survival against Carthage, turned its attention eastward, toward a world it had no business challenging. Mainland Greece was old. Its cities had produced philosophy, democracy, and warfare doctrine, centuries before Rome existed as more than a cluster of hills beside a river. And yet, within 2 generations, that older world would answer to Roman magistrates. The mystery historians still argue over isn't whether this happened, it's how something so implausible ever succeeded. The answer begins not on a battlefield, but in a room full of quarreling ambassadors. Greece by this point was not one nation, it was dozens of fiercely independent city-states and leagues, bound together by language and religion, but almost never by common cause. Since the death of Alexander the Great over a century earlier, the Eastern Mediterranean had fractured into a permanent, simmering rivalry, kingdoms and confederacies competing for advantage, each one certain that today's ally was tomorrow's threat. Into this fractured landscape stepped Roman envoys, offering something almost irresistible: protection. Rome's approach was patient in a way that unsettled its rivals more than any army could. Roman leaders built alliances one city at a time, always careful never to overstay their welcome, always careful never to lean too heavily on a single partner. When one league grew troublesome, Rome simply courted its rival instead. A coastal power struggling against raiders in the Aegean would find Roman ships conveniently nearby. A kingdom nervous about an overbearing neighbor would find Roman diplomats offering reassurance and, quietly, obligation. Piece by piece, without a single decisive war, Rome became indispensable to half of Greece before most Greeks realized what indispensable would eventually cost them. But diplomacy alone doesn't explain everything. Geography played its own hand. Rome's power in the east didn't rest primarily on Roman ships or Roman soldiers. It rested on Rome's ability to borrow the strength of others. Greek maritime powers, drawn into Rome's orbit through alliance, gave Roman forces something they could never have built alone: total control of the sea lanes. That control meant supply lines that never broke, reinforcements that always arrived, and enemies who could be isolated island by island, coastline by coastline. When Rome did eventually turn against a former ally that grew too powerful at sea, the message was unambiguous. No independent Greek naval power would be permitted to rival Roman interests, whatever the cost to that city's population. On land, the terrain itself seemed to conspire against the old Hellenic way of war. Twice, once against a father, once against his son, both kings of Macedon, the legendary Macedonian phalanx met Roman legions on broken, hilly ground, and twice, the result exposed a fatal weakness. The phalanx was a wall of spears, unstoppable in open, level terrain, where every soldier could hold the line shoulder to shoulder. But walls don't climb hills well. Fog, uneven slopes, and rocky ground broke the Macedonian formation apart at exactly the moments it needed to hold together, while the more flexible Roman legion adapted, split, and closed in around the gaps. What should have been Macedon's home field advantage became its undoing. Still, none of this fully explains why so many Greeks didn't simply unite against the common threat. That answer lies in an older wound. For generations, the Macedonians, nominally Greek themselves, had dominated and humiliated the southern city-states. Memory of that domination ran deep, deeper than any looming fear of Rome. When a charismatic Roman commander arrived on Greek soil and declared, in a public proclamation still recorded by ancient historians, that he had come not to conquer but to free the Greek cities from Macedonian control, the message landed exactly as intended. Rome positioned itself not as a foreign predator, but as a liberator settling an old score on the Greeks' behalf. It was, perhaps, the single most effective piece of political theater in the ancient world, and it worked precisely because it contained a grain of truth wrapped around a much larger lie. By the time the illusion faded, it was too late to act on the realization. Roman legions withdrew after each campaign, only to return again a few years later, slightly more entrenched each time. There was no single dramatic invasion to rally against. Only a slow tightening, city by city, alliance by alliance, until resistance no longer had anywhere left to organize itself. And beneath the diplomacy and the geography sat something more fundamental: raw military experience. While many Greek city-states fielded citizen levies that fought seasonally, close to home, Roman soldiers and officers had been forged in decades of brutal, continent-spanning warfare against Carthage. They had learned logistics in Spain, cavalry tactics through hard-won trial and error, and discipline through repeated defeat and recovery. That accumulated knowledge, unglamorous, unromantic, and utterly decisive, gave Roman commanders an edge that no single Greek army, however brave, could match in the moment it mattered most. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, the transformation was complete. The proud, fractured world of the Greek city-states had become a patchwork of Roman clients and provinces. Corinth, once a symbol of Greek maritime defiance, was leveled as a warning to any city that considered following its example. And the sun that had illuminated centuries of Hellenic independence quietly, almost imperceptibly, set. But conquest is not the same as erasure. Greek philosophy, Greek art, and Greek language would go on to shape Rome itself so completely that later generations struggled to say where one culture ended and the other began. The victors, in the end, could not stop admiring and absorbing everything they had taken. So the real question isn't only why Rome won. It's what winning actually meant when the conquered civilization went on to quietly conquer its conqueror from the inside. If this kind of slow, patient unraveling of a civilization fascinates you, subscribe. There's a lot more buried history waiting to be dug back up.